We have with us here in the Right India studios today Jaishree Misra, the 10th of our 11 Right India authors. We begin with Jaishree Misra's passage on the 6th of April, and she is an author who straddles countries as well as genres. Jaishree lives between England and India, and she writes literary as well as commercial fiction. So Jaishree, you are also an author who has had the distinction of being banned by the UP government for a book of yours called Rani. So how did you feel about it? Tell us about that experience.
This was a work of historical fiction which I'd based on the life of Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi. I was very keen to do a fairly big historical fiction book. I knew it had to be the British Indian period because of the straddling between these two. I was working at the time in England and I used to come to India frequently for family. So it made sense to pick a period where I would understand both cultures and be able to sort of move between the characters and the cultures. So Rani Lakshmibai was a kind of obvious choice because I wanted a really strong female protagonist. I knew, I think, even as I started writing her story, that I was probably playing a little bit with fire because she is one of these big, sort of iconic figures from our history. And I know how people tend to sort of think we should leave them alone and not sort of touch them, and they're sort of sacred and hallowed and not to be messed with. Now, I just wanted, the problem, I suppose, of people who didn't like the book was that I didn't want to focus on that figure that I had learnt about in my school history lessons when we came to the 1857 uprising and all of that, which was just this warrior figure sitting on a horse, carrying, sort of going into war and then eventually losing her life on the battlefield. I knew I wanted more than that because that figure, when I was a child studying it in my school primary history book, puzzled me. I couldn't understand why a woman that young would strap her child on her back and go into battle, and just a battle that was actually already lost. And then she laid her life down for a cause that was really quite useless by that point. So it was, that puzzling over why a young woman would do that, would take on the might of the British Army and all that, was what I wanted to get at. I wanted to figure out the woman behind the warrior. So I wanted to see Lakshmibai as a daughter and as a wife, a young wife. She got married when she was 14. She was a young widow because she lost her husband when she was still only in her mid-20s. All of that was far more important to me, to see her as that, the person behind the warrior.
So you were breathing life into aspects of her personality which were hitherto unknown.
Absolutely. That
you
was
seem
the bit
to
I
have
wanted.
an affinity for history, for historical fiction, really, because your latest book, A Love Story for My Sister, also has two stories running in parallel, where you talk about a girl in 1857 during the mutiny who gets abducted and then falls in love with her kidnapper, and you talk about the Stockholm Syndrome. And then you're running a parallel story in contemporary times. How did that happen? How did you, think about running a parallel story of a girl who gets kidnapped and raped in contemporary times with an historical story?
The story of Margaret Wheeler, this young 18-year-old English girl, daughter of General Wheeler, who got kidnapped by this, one of the soldiers during the Kanpur part of the uprising, came when I was researching Rani Lakshmibai. So the story emerged at that point.
There.
Strong connection. They had probably never met each other or even heard about, well, Margaret might have heard about the Queen of Jhansi. But the story emerged and fascinated me to such an extent that I nearly dropped. There's one stage when I thought, let me drop the Lakshmibai story. Everyone knows her story. Nobody's heard about Margaret, this poor girl. But then I knew that, by then I'd already reached a certain stage in Rani's story. So I kind of kept this on the back burner. And that was my second historical fiction book that I was going to write, was the story of Margaret Wheeler. But it was at that time, while I was halfway through, or more than halfway through telling Margaret's story, that the Nirbhaya case happened. And I was writing this book when I was in Delhi at that point in time, watching these scenes of outrage on television, and of course feeling the anguish of that terrible incident. It sort of suddenly seemed to me that I was doing something wrong. It sounds ridiculous to say that, but I felt it was wrong to be telling the story of a young woman to whom terrible things happened in 1857, when those things are still happening on our streets in contemporary Delhi, the city where I grew up, the city where I kind of was still living and wandering around. And it wasn't just Nirbhaya's story, there were so many. I used to see it in the papers, and I thought, I really need to have some, I needed to tell a different story. And because I didn't want to lose the Margaret story, what I did was tell the story of a contemporary modern day. She's only a schoolgirl, she's in high school, but she's about the same age as Margaret, young Tara Fernandez, who gets kidnapped when she's on her way home from school. And that's where the contemporary narrative came from. And what I did in the end was combine the two stories together. I kind of intertwined them because I didn't want to lose the tragedy of Margaret's story as well. By introducing the third character, who's Tara's sister, a young novelist. She's an aspiring novelist, telling Margaret's story, but also her sister's.
Yeah, and it's beautifully juxtaposed. I mean, you don't want to lose trail of either of the stories when you're reading the book, so it's really very well done.
Thank you.
You also have done some books where you've, there's an autobiographical element, particularly your first book, Ancient Promises.
Yeah.
So that has a very strong autobiographical element. Is that what got you started into writing, like the need to express yourself, to purge yourself of some emotions? Is that how you became a writer?
Not consciously. I think that all of that did happen. I did purge myself a lot of emotion that had been bottled up when I wrote Ancient Promises. But its beginning was actually a very mundane, very sort of ordinary one, because it wasn't intended to be a novel. So when I first started writing what eventually became Ancient Promises, the intention was really just to write what was going to be a 2 or maybe 4-page memoir. To some extent, it was like a letter of explanation that I was writing to my husband, to try and explain to him the reasons, things that he had never understood, about my life and what had brought us both up to that point. And that involved telling the story of my first marriage. So I was literally merely going to sit down and write 4 pages to try and explain certain things. And the scene I opened up with was of my first marriage. It was an arranged marriage in Kerala. And those scenes were very vivid in my mind. And I thought, I'll stop it there. I'll kind of explain a few things and then stop the thing there. And cliched as it might sound, I literally couldn't stop. Once I'd opened up those, I think, memories that I had locked away for a long time. I hadn't, all those events had happened 10 years before the writing of it. Suddenly, kind of got opened up. I'd given myself permission to open up, and given myself permission to, as you very astutely kind of figured out, was something I needed to do and express myself and express all of this emotion that was otherwise probably going to do some kind of damage somewhere along the way to me. So it was a very intensely cathartic to kind of experience the writing of that book. There were days when I'd be weeping tears and snot onto my keyboard. So I needed.
Writing participants should know that they don't really have to do that in order to write the stories that they send to us. But I think that must be really a part of, that is definitely a part of strong writing. When you are talking about something that happened to you, something you experienced, or somebody close to you experienced, that's what really accounts for strong writing, isn't it?
It doesn't have to be autobiographical, as you said. But I think there are things that we can even pick up from our immediate surroundings, things that have happened to someone else we might love, where you can sort of, if you're a good writer, you're a skilled writer, and you feel things, you're empathetic enough to be able to get into the heads of other people and create these characters, then you can do it without your having experienced it directly yourself. Many of the things I've written about subsequently are experiences that I haven't actually had myself. You can't. I mean, thankfully my life isn't that turbulent to produce nine novels.
So do you think as a woman writer it's always easier to write from a woman's viewpoint? Or have you ever tried writing from a man's viewpoint?
I tried it with book number 3 afterwards. It's the story of a young man who loses his wife and then carries her ashes back to India.
How did you do that? Did you find it easy to get into a man's skin and think like a man?
I think I was terrible at it, actually. What I did was I got 2 male friends to read an early manuscript of the book and correct, the bits where I'd either sounded too feminine or where the feelings. I had to work a lot harder at it than I would normally. And I remember one of my friends saying, and this was an English guy, I got one Indian guy and one English guy to read it because the male protagonist is an Indian chap who lives in the UK, and he brings his wife's ashes back to India. So I needed someone to give me perspectives on both. And the English friend said to me, this guy sounds sort of half Edwardian lady and half Essex man, which is his way of saying someone really rough and, so talking all rough and tough. And the other bit all sort of ladylike. So I think I needed a lot of cleaning up. And it wasn't just in terms of the language that this this man, my character, was using, but also the way he thinks.
Yeah.
That I had to kind of.
So you
work
took
at.
help from
I did.
friends, yeah.
I did.
Yeah, I guess you have to. That's all part
There's nothing wrong
of the
with using
experience.
readers.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's
And,
probably
where do you feel more inspired to write?
the fact that I seem to write better about England when I'm in India and
Yeah.
about India when I'm in England. I think that comes from the thing that Salman Rushdie once talked about when he said, he described it as stepping out of the frame in order to see the picture better.
Yeah.
So I think it's easier generally to be objective
Mhm,
or just to see everything
Yes, when you're a bit far away.
far away from it.
What
Right?
you're
Maybe I
writing
need to be
about, yes.
physically removed from a place to
Mhm,
write
mhm.
effectively about it.
Yeah. So, Jaishree, when we first spoke about Write India, and when I spoke to you and you so easily and eagerly accepted being part of the entire project, when we were not even sure what it would be like, when we spoke about it, then what did you think about Write India at that stage, and how do you think it's developed?
Goodness, I thought it was so exciting, so much potential. I know that this was a stage at which you were still trying to work out, and in some ways it's still growing organically,
Yes,
isn't it? That's the exciting thing about it, I think, is that it's got huge potential. I had never heard of anything like it. I don't know if there are other schemes like it, but between my worlds of England and India and all that, I'd never really heard of a scheme like it. And it's the kind of thing that I would have loved to have had when I was a young aspiring author myself. I used to dream about, the thing is, you don't know where to take your stories. You might have 10 stories in your head and you're thinking, what do I do with them? Even if I write them down, it'll all go into some file or somewhere in the depths of my computer. Here you are, you're offering this platform to people who have these stories, and most of us have a story sort of waiting to be told inside of us, except that some people tell it better than others, and those are the ones who are going to rise to the top and become the cream that you skim off and find.
Yeah, and I can tell you it's a real pleasure to read these stories. When we started off, initially we were scared that we wouldn't even get enough stories to be really be proud of and be able to talk about it and say that we got a reasonable number of stories. But now we've been flooded.
Big numbers,
We've been
isn't
flooded.
it?
We've got
Yeah.
thousands and thousands of stories. And it's a pleasure to read them, because the other thing we were scared of was that the language would be so bad. That it would be a pain to read those stories. But really speaking, and I keep saying this again and again, that if we have 10 winners every month, there are many, many more who could almost have been there in the same position.
You see,
beautiful
you need to
stories,
do
really.
this all the time. I think year after year you should carry on with the scheme. I mean, I haven't had my turn yet. Mine's coming up next month, isn't it?
Yes.
So I can't wait. I really can't wait to see the stories. I mean, just the idea that I, with my one paragraph, could have sparked off a whole
Yes.
sea of stories.
And
How
also
exciting.
your passage is very different. In fact, I don't know how this happened. When I picked up the authors, I thought I was picking up authors from different genres. And then suddenly there came a time, I think there's something in the air this year, the last year and this year, that everybody started writing romances.
Oh.
Somebody as unlikely as a Ravi Subramanian, who was writing on banking thrillers, he wrote a romance.
Did he?
Then
You should leave that to us.
Yes,
To people
yes,
who
that's
specialize
exactly
in
what Ravinder
romance.
said. How can he get into my area? And then you had Ravinder Singh, you have Durjoy, you had Tuhin Sinha writing a romance, you had Preeti Shinha writing a romance. So apart from Chetan, Amish and Ashwin, who were the first three Write India authors, almost everybody's given us romances. Madhuri's given us a romance. So now we are just eagerly waiting for your passage to be unveiled.
It's not quite romance. You could turn it into a
Well,
romance.
those who are die-hard romantics may still be able to turn it
Exactly.
into a romance, but not really. And then after that we have Anita Nair.
Uh-huh.
So with both of you, we are kind of bringing in a
different
fresh wave,
direction.
really, yes, and changing the direction. And that I think will really work, and
Good.
we'll have a further surge in our numbers.
I'm so pleased to hear that.
Thank you so much for being here with us today, and thank you for being part of Write India.
Thank you, Write India, for inviting me to this scheme. I'm really pleased to be a part of it.